We have a very special guest with us today, Isobel Redmond, the Leader of the Opposition, and we've got some great questions. Welcome, Isobel.
Thank you, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Christmas and New Year were pretty quick, wasn't it?
It was. Wonderful time.
Isobel, we're really here to find out the policy and the thoughts on a number of property issues.
Yep.
So you happy for me to get right amongst it?
Absolutely.
Look, the first thing that's very topical, a big election issue, is land tax. So looking at land taxes, the annual average land tax liability for South Australians is 62% above the national average, according to the figures from the Institute of Public Affairs in December 2008. Why?
Well, for a number of reasons, mostly because our land tax gets very much out of whack above about $1 million unimproved capital value. And we have obviously this problem with multiple holdings. So in South Australia, the properties that you own other than the one that you live in, the total value of those is put together to assess your land tax. And a lot of people have a lot more value than they expected, and that, together with the fact that the rate, once you're over $1 million, is so high, means that our land tax in this state is simply uncompetitive.
Well, the rate goes to 3.7% over $1 million, which in anyone's language, any investor, that's 50% of what they'd expect to get returned from. So the impact of that amount being paid out, let's say to a shop owner, or if it's a large residential investor, it must flow through to the common person, the shopkeeper and the...
Absolutely. In fact, one of the things I try to make people understand is that even if you are not directly getting a land tax bill, we are all paying land tax because almost all businesses in this state run out of rented premises. If they are rented premises, there's a landlord who's getting a land tax bill. He's passing it on to the tenant, who's your shopkeeper or whoever, and they're passing it on in their costs to you. So we are all, in a way, paying land tax. But more importantly, what it's doing is forcing investment out of the state.
Now, I know that a number of investors have been very vocal about this. They don't get a great sympathy vote because they've probably got a lot of money. But the experience you've got, how do you get the Harry Perks of this world, who has told me, you know Harry?
Yep.
Firsthand, that he's buying outside this state. I've had a head of one of the key people in the Greek community ring me specifically and say, we are no longer purchasing in this state, we're selling and we're moving out of the state, they've had enough. Are you getting the same feedback?
Absolutely, and indeed I've seen letters from other organisations saying to would-be investors in this state, we recommend you consider investing elsewhere than in South Australia. And of course that has an impact on the availability of rental premises, for instance, so that, you know, a young couple wanting to rent their first house rather than buy, there's less available, and that pushes the rental prices up. But unfortunately Kevin Foley seems to think that it doesn't matter because it's only rich people who've got extra places and they're the only ones paying land tax, but we all pay the effects of it.
Well, I can assure you that with our residential clientele, we have a number of residential landlords that have had to put their rents up because they've got to a point where they were losing money. They were actually losing money. So it's not greed, it's just survival. Okay, now the Liberal Party, easy in opposition for rhetoric. What commitment will you make if you get in on land tax? Well,
on land tax we've already made a very specific commitment. It's in two parts, and the first part's a very clear financial commitment that we will raise the threshold from unimproved capital value of $110,000, which is where it's at the moment, to $250,000. So a very significant increase, more than doubling. That will immediately drop out of the system some 57,000 people who are currently paying land tax. Under this government, we've gone from 69,000 people paying land tax to 188,000 people paying land tax. So increasing that threshold will immediately drop out 57,000 people, and it will give a benefit of up to $420 a year to those who are still paying. Now that, I think, will have a good effect on the people at the sort of mum and dad investors who've got the spare house that they're renting out to try to secure their own futures and so on. It will have minimal impact, and we recognise that, on the commercial person. The average person in commercial area is paying some $30,000 on commercial premises for land tax every year, and they're getting massive escalations as the value of their property goes up. So that's the first part of it. The second part is that we have made an absolute commitment that we will bring our land tax into line with the other states so that we will be competitive.
Hallelujah. And the big issue from our point of view in the industry is that we are not competitive, and in the property world it's not ideal, because it means that our tenants are paying more money than they need to for that competitiveness. Okay, now, so let's say you've made those changes. Where's the sting? Where do you pick up the extra cash?
Well, we've already identified some $200 million in the budget that we can count as savings, and in fact, in particular, when we announced this particular policy, we said we think we can find the money for that in simply reducing the amount of government advertising, because the government in the first 6 months of this year spent $23 million on advertising, and we think that there is a need for some advertising. You do have to advertise as a government, if you change the watering restrictions, or if you have particular information about bushfire readiness and things like that. There's legitimate government advertising, but I don't think it's necessary for a government to advertise their budget, for instance, and $23 million didn't even meet their own guidelines. Some of it's being investigated by the Auditor General. So there's things like that where we believe we can make savings, because that one promise going from $110,000 to $250,000 will cost us around about $31 million a year.
And the top end of town, the big commercial developers or investors, any news for them? Anything on the horizon?
Only that minimal saving in the first instance, and the promise that we will attend to this, because although it's not what I call one of the sexy issues that people, it's not front of mind for most electors, they don't
their rent's front of mind.
That's right. Their rent is front of mind, but people don't realise just how much land tax and this issue is actually impacting on investment in South Australia, on the ability of businesses to stay in South Australia, on a whole range of things that are happening here, and we believe it is absolutely essential that we address this, and that's why the second part of the promise is in fact, I think, the more important one, and that is that we will bring our land tax into line with the other states, because it gets completely out of kilter with the other states, as we said, at about the $1 million mark, where we go way high, and we're 3 and 4 times as high as other states.
Now, Isobel, you may not be aware of this, but in November, I think it was, of last year, they changed the definition for land tax purposes, which meant that an owner that had, say, a 1/100th share with another party suddenly became consolidated to take it through to the 3.7%. A lot of those people were paying under the $1 million threshold. Now, the effect of that is, with some of our landlords, about a 600% increase in their land tax. Have you heard of this, and are you aware of it?
We have heard of it, and indeed we get a constant stream of people bringing us stories of unbelievable land tax increases, and that's why we've recognised that it's a major problem that we need to address, and the government, in closing that loophole, has in fact created a problem for a lot of would-be investors, and I think what we'll see, if that isn't remedied, we'll see people going into other states for investment.
I would argue that because we're property people, I would argue that it was never a loophole.
No,
it was the
legitimate
rate that was struck, because if it was a loophole, they would have prosecuted people. So they changed the law, which means they changed the formula. So in essence, they've increased very substantially from last year. Very substantially, they've effectively increased that rate.
Yeah, well, and I agree. It wasn't a loophole. It was a perfectly legitimate way to conduct your affairs. My very first tax law case that I ever learnt was the Inland Revenue Commissioners and the Duke of Westminster, in which it was made quite clear law that anything that's within the law is what you should be doing.
Yeah.
No one wants to maximise their tax, and it was a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And it becomes a nonsense then if you can't have different entities holding properties.
So if the average rate that was pre the change generated X amount of income for the government, and now it's 3X because of the change that they made, where's the extra 2 times of the revenue gone?
Into general revenue, and this government just spends it.
Right.
It's a shame.
Will you promise that you'll look into that?
I'll absolutely promise to look into that, because I think there are a number of issues, and we've had some ridiculous issues come to us in terms of land tax and stamp duty and the way they're managed in this state, and there seems to be little flexibility in a whole range of areas there.